Yuri Gagarin was the first human ever to see Earth from space, but 7 years later, he vanished from the sky in a training jet. For decades, the Soviet Union buried the details of that crash so deeply that the world filled the silence with rumors. Some people blamed pilot error, others whispered sabotage, and a few even claimed the first man in space had not died at all. The truth is less cinematic than the wildest theories, but somehow more disturbing. This is the mystery of Yuri Gagarin's final flight and why the answer stayed hidden for nearly half a century. On April 12, 1961, Gagarin launched aboard Vostok 1 and became the first human being in space. His spacecraft circled Earth in a flight that lasted 108 minutes. He returned not just as a pilot, but as a living symbol of Soviet achievement. Posters carried his smile, streets took his name, and the government turned him into proof that the Soviet system could conquer the heavens. But fame did not make him free. Gagarin became more symbol than man, traveling the world while ordinary Soviet citizens wrote to him, begging for help. By the late 1960s, he wanted to prove he was still a real pilot, not just a poster on a wall. So he returned to fighter training, flying from Chkalovsky Airfield northeast of Moscow. On March 27, 1968, the weather was rainy, windy, and already getting worse. That morning, Gagarin was scheduled for 3 practice flights, 2 solo missions, and 1 with instructor Vladimir Seryogin. Before boarding the bus, he realized he had forgotten his identification, and he reportedly called it a bad omen. A little after 10 a.m., Gagarin and Seryogin climbed into a 2-seat MiG-15 UTI training jet. The flight was supposed to be routine. They took off, headed to the training zone, and began a set of maneuvers in deteriorating weather. Minutes later, Gagarin radioed that the exercise was complete and he was returning to base. Then the radio went silent. 10 minutes passed with no sighting, no reply, and no jet returning through the clouds. By afternoon, search teams found the wreckage burning among trees and snow in the Russian countryside. At first, rescuers hoped Gagarin had ejected. The next day, that hope ended when his remains were found near the crash site. The Soviet Union had lost its brightest space hero at only 34 years old. The public needed an answer, and the government needed that answer to be safe. A state commission investigated the crash and produced a massive 29-volume report. But instead of a clear answer, the official conclusion offered a cautious possibility. The report said the pilots may have swerved to avoid a bird, a weather balloon, or some foreign object, sending the MiG into a fatal spin. To civilians, it sounded possible. To many aviation professionals, it sounded incomplete. Then, Leonid Brezhnev closed the investigation and classified the details. That secrecy created the perfect fuel for conspiracy. Rumors claimed Gagarin had been drunk, joyriding, sabotaged by jealous officials, or even eliminated by foreign intelligence. One of the strangest stories claimed he survived the crash and was hidden away in a Soviet psychiatric ward. The KGB investigated many of those claims and reportedly ruled out the wilder explanations. But ruling out rumors was not the same as telling the public what happened. After the Soviet Union collapsed, pieces of the story slowly began to emerge. In 2003, declassified KGB material pointed toward air traffic and communication failures. According to that theory, controllers gave the pilots bad weather information and failed to communicate key details about the aircraft. One detail was especially dangerous. The MiG may have been carrying wing-mounted fuel tanks during maneuvers. Then came another technical theory, built around a faulty or open cockpit air vent. Researchers argued that if the vent was open at altitude, the pilots may have followed the manual and descended too aggressively. At the time, the manual did not define the descent rate limit, later clarified in the 1970s. That version made the pilots victims of procedure, not recklessness. But the most famous late explanation came from Alexei Leonov, the first person to walk in space. Leonov was at the airbase that day, and he said he heard two loud booms close together. His version was that a larger Su-15 jet flew far lower than it was supposed to and passed dangerously close to Gagarin's MiG. In heavy clouds, the Su-15 pilot may not have realized how close he came. The wake turbulence from the larger aircraft could have rolled the smaller trainer and thrown it into a deep spiral. Computer simulations reportedly showed that this scenario matched the known trajectory better than the official bird or balloon explanation. Leonov was allowed to speak publicly, but not to identify the Su-15 pilot. That restraint made the story feel even more like an unfinished confession. So which explanation is the truth? Bad weather data, a cockpit vent, or the Su-15 wake? The honest answer is that the exact final chain of events may never be proven beyond doubt. But the strongest explanations all point away from drunkenness, sabotage, or UFOs, and toward a tragic chain of aviation errors. That is why the cover-up matters more than the crash itself. If the disaster was an ordinary military failure near Moscow, the Soviet state still saw it as too embarrassing to tell the truth. The world's first space hero had been made untouchable in life and almost unreadable in death. For the public, Gagarin was a legend. For investigators, he was a file nobody was allowed to fully open. And for the pilots who understood the risks, his death was a reminder that even heroes are still vulnerable to weather, procedure, and human error. Today, the most convincing version is not that Gagarin was murdered, but that his death was preventable. That is the darkest part of the mystery. Not aliens, spies, or secret assassins, but a system too proud to admit a simple mistake. Yuri Gagarin once looked down at Earth and saw a blue planet without borders. 7 years later, he died inside a cloud bank, trapped inside the borders of secrecy. The crash took his life, but the cover-up turned his death into a legend of its own. And that is why the question still echoes. What really happened when the first man in space fell back to Earth?